I'm going to give the background on Finns in Maynard, and then the two speakers from this group are going to talk about the history of this particular organization. The Finns, there are not very many of them in the world. There's 5 million Finns in the country, and there's another million floating around the world in various places, and about almost 750,000 of them are in the United States. Now these are Finns who marked themselves to have Finnish blood on the last census. So it's not a big nationality. When we talk about the Italians or the Germans who came over here, there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. There were not that many Finns. But when they settled in one particular town, around one particular industry, and often from one particular section of Finland where everybody knew each other, they were related, etc., then such a phenomenon as a Finn town grew up. And these Finn towns were all the same. It didn't matter whether they were here in the east or whether they were out in Minnesota or in Michigan, where the majority of Finns settled, or if they were out in Seattle or in Washington and Oregon, or whether they were down along the coast in California. No matter where a goodly number of Finns got into one town, the same sort of thing happened. And Maynard is a good example of it. So let me just name the things that make up a Finn town. There was a book written by a Finnish newspaperman who came through the country in 1895, and he reported in that book that there were already 200 Finns in Maynard at that time. 200 in 1895. By 1920, there were 10 times that many, because of course we're counting the second generation by that time. But by 1920, the population of Maynard is about between a quarter and a third Finnish. That's a lot of Finns. By 1894, the Lutherans were able to get together enough to form a church, and about 13 or 14 years later, they had been worshiping and growing enough to put up a building, an actual church building. In 1895, a temperance society was formed. Many of these Finns who came over here were young. Not very many of them were married. They were all single, mostly men. And what do they do on the weekend except drink? The bar room was the place to go. And so in every Finn town, after the Lutheran church is formed, then a temperance society is formed. And the temperance society is there to keep them out of the bar rooms, to give them something to do on the, while they have some free time. Finland, as you know, was a part of Russia at this time. It was a Grand Duchy of Russia. And many of the political things that were beginning to happen in Russia were also happening in Finland. So many of these young Finns that came over here already had a little bit of experience in the socialist movement, which was starting to form in those countries. And so by 1903, there was a socialist organization formed, and they grew fast and furiously, so that by 1912, they were able to build a hall. That hall is still standing down there at the lights near what we call Paper Mill Corner, where 62 and 27 come together. That ugly brown building which has an auto parts store in it now. That was the Socialist Hall. The leftists, these people who had this background, formed a Finnish co-op. And this happened in every Finn town. And so in 1907, the co-op is formed. By 6 years later, in 1913, there are those people who do not want to worship as the Lutherans do, but who are part of what in Finland is called the Free Church, but which is a congregational form of church structure. So in 1913, the Finnish Congregational Church is formed, and that building is still there on the corner of Walnut and Thompson, right? And then the what happens in Russia again affects us when the Bolshevik Revolution takes place. The argument amongst the leftists is all over the country, in every Finn town, put to a vote, and the people who are in the majority keep the property, and the people who are in the minority are kicked out and have to find their own place. Mostly in the Midwest and on the West Coast, the communists won. They ended up with the property in most every case, and the socialists, the so-called social democrats, were left out to fend for themselves. But here on the East Coast, it was the other way around. Practically in every town, the socialists were in the majority, the Bolsheviks, the communists, were put out, and they formed their own federation in 1920 when they were kicked out, and they built a hall up on Waltham Street in 1922, which was probably the best of all the Finnish halls in the area because it was brand new, and the high school used to play their basketball games there. The Elks Lodge was founded in that building, but it burned down in 1932, so that is gone. Now, in addition to all these organizations, always a part of Finntown everywhere, there were bands. Each of the clubs, the socialists and the temperance, had their own band. They had their own choruses. They had their own dramatic societies. In every Finntown, there were saunas, obviously. I can count at least 5 public saunas, maybe more. There were boarding houses where these young people lived, and there was housing that was very crowded, not very much unlike what we see now when the new nationalities come into town. They take in friendly families, they take in relatives, and pretty soon there's a lot of people living in a house. If you go through the poll tax records on some of the streets in the teens, you'll find out that the people that own the house live there, and there's 4 guys living in one of the bedrooms, and there's 4 more guys living in another bedroom. They must be sleeping in turn, I don't know. And so that's the situation. So Maynard is a typical Finn town, just like every other with those organizations. And then another one is formed, and we'll let the folks here tell you about them. Who's first? Susan? Ellen?
Thank you, Roy. It's a pleasure to see so many of the old hometown people here, just delighted. And I hope that you will find some interest in what we are exhibiting and showing. Move over, Ellen.
He wants you to stand behind the table so you can...
Oh. I thought I was closer this way. Our society, the Ladies and Knights of Kaleva, was actually formed about 100, the first lodge was formed about 100 years ago out in the Midwest in Montana. There was John Stone who found the conditions of the Finns quite deplorable, as Roy was mentioned, you know, the drinking and etc. And when he came to the country, he decided that they should have some sort of organization that would keep the people on the, well, you might say on the decent side. He found his organizations after something went well, like the Order of the Elks or Odd Fellows, and it's known as the Kaleva Ritarikunta, or the Knights and the Ladies of Kaleva. Maybe Finns are contrary, but usually the good things move from east to west, but the Finns formed their organization out west and they moved east. Through the years, several lodges and were formed, and currently there are about 50 ladies' women's lodges, and there are about 49 or so men's lodges. There are 2 in Canada, 2 women and 2 men's lodges in Canada. The activities that we have are not really overwhelming, but they are more cultural oriented. But as Roy talked about these different organizations, each had his own way of wanting to develop and preserve the Finnish culture. They were very interested in speakers, in poetry, music, and wanted to bring so much of their homeland to their new country. Our particular organization, the Ladies and Knights of Kaleva, was formed 84 years ago in 1915. It was not a big group, it was just a very small group, and they met, well, actually their meetings were first held at the Tempest Hall. Many of this organization, many of the members were members of the Tempest Society. From there they branched out and kind of wanted to have their own meeting places, and they rented small halls. Well, I think the Eagles Hall was one of them, and then at the Congregationalist Church, they kind of drew away from the Tempest Society. Then about 1941, they realized their own little building. It was called the Pirtti, which is kind of a cute little Finnish name. It is the location, or was in the location, where the telephone building currently is located on River Street. In about 1921, the latter part of 1921, the organization found out about some property for sale here on the shore of Fort Pond. We had one member, John Mickeline, and he was quite an entrepreneur who was very interested. He and his cousin rented, they owned a cabin diagonally across from the pond. And then the end of 1921, they had been skating on the pond, and they heard about this property being for sale. They took off their skates and ran uphill to find out from the person who was selling the property. The name was Conan, and she told them that it's not available. And one of the persons that had put money down on it was Attorney Wilson from Maynard. Well, John offered $50 from his own pocket, saying that, well, he would like to have a property held for the organization, the Ladies and Knights of Kaleva. Well, it kind of stood hanging balance for a while, but apparently Attorney Wilson and his friend changed their mind, and so the Kalevites acquired this 16 odd acres that they have here by the lake. The Finns have always loved the countrysides there. They love the lakes, fishing, they love nature especially. And so this was ideal, and they started off with great enthusiasm. There's a lot of land clearing. The place was practically barren, just a few birch trees around, and that's about it. And one interesting thing that they did have here was a lime pit. Apparently at some time or another, lime had been mined here, which I don't know much about geology, but a son of mine who has studied said that he was surprised to know that there was such a thing in this area as mining for lime. Some of the caves or the pits are still visible, although they have been somewhat covered up. Through the years, well, first of all, the big thing was to have a meeting hall, and they built this, what we call the old section. And many of us have a very nostalgic feeling about that. We remember that since we were little kids. And, well, anyhow, it was not feasible to maintain two properties. This came about in the 1990s. So they sold the property in Maynard and put the money toward building what we have here. It's not ostentatious, it's just fine for our use, and there are people that are quite interested in renting it. Through the years we've had bands, this was in the formative years of the 20s, bands, as Roy talked, there were bands, choruses, and so forth and so on. And we had many visitors from out of town that used to come for the summer festivals. The latest interesting thing we had a group of Finns here, the Finnish Veterans Chorus, and of course they brought back many of the old memories of the Finnish programs that we did have here. One person, I don't know, is Herb Zorka here?
Yeah.
Herb, stand up, please. He is our very special breakfast man. I don't know how many of you have heard about Sunday morning breakfast, but Herb does a magnificent job. He makes the pancakes. We had helpers. Bob, he cooks the eggs, and it has been a very, very successful program, and somehow given us a fairly good name, I think, in the area, and we've had wonderful support from people from Acton, Maynard, and other areas. The property itself is maintained by a combined group of men and women. It's known as the Civic Association. This was to cover legal problems. And they maintain the property, whereas the ladies and men rent. Few of the members own, there are about 20 cottages, and some of the members own the cottages from way back when, in the early 1922, the first of them were built. But all in all, I find it a great pleasure that you are interested in this modest place, and happy to see all of you here. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Susan Alatalo. You may know me from the Maynard Historical Society secretary, and I'm also a longtime member of the Ladies of Kaleva and the Kaleva Civic Association. I thought I would make a few remarks on some of the interesting aspects of the Finnish-American culture, since I am a product of that. The Kaleva name, from which we derive our organization's name, comes from the Finnish national epic called the Kalevala. And that's a series of stories about heroes and nature and adventures. And this tapestry that hangs here and has always been in our clubhouse depicts one of the stories. You can see a witch, stirring a big pot and the smoke coming out and sort of making something magical happen. And that's what occurs a lot in Finnish folklore, is magic. Sometimes it's caused by nature. Like the Native Americans, I think the Finnish culture attaches a lot of special qualities to, say, the trees, animals, and they really respect nature and its cycles. In 1835, an ancient country doctor was roaming around Finland, and he went and collected all of these old runes or stories that the small villages used to recite. He recorded them. They were only passed down orally prior to that, and it was in an ancient language that is not like the language spoken in the countries surrounding Finland, namely Russia, Sweden. The Finnish language is much closer to Hungarian and Estonian, and that sort of says a little bit about what happened in ancient history when these people, these nomads, kept trying to settle in different parts of the world, and supposedly they were always sort of, thrown out. So they finally settled on this big granite peninsula called Finland, and they had traveled from quite some distance, perhaps from the Estonian area. It's not really known. It's a linguistic mystery. People who study language really tend to be attracted to the Finnish language. Finland is also probably the only country in the world that celebrates a book for a holiday. They have a holiday called Kalevala. And traditionally, when this long epic poem is recited in Finnish, two people sit cross-legged from each other and they hook their hands in and they repeat this very sing-song rhythm. And they play the ancient gondola, which is like a zither. And according to the Kaleva legend, the zither came from the backbone of a fish. You know how the spine goes like that? That's how they originally invented this musical instrument called the gondola. So the Finnish singers would always have the accent on the Finnish word with the first accent. So Alatalo, that's how it would be pronounced. So every Finnish word starts with the accent being on the first syllable. And so that makes it kind of sing-song, and they rock back and forth and recite these poems. And this Kalevala has been translated in many, many languages, including, and it's also been the inspiration for many fine works, such as John Sibelius's songs, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem Hiawatha is directly based on Kalevala. And Longfellow, as we know, spent some time in nearby Sudbury. So the struggle between good and evil and why natural phenomena occur are some of the other themes that have provided fodder for artists and musicians throughout time. In the early 1900s, because of this popularity of the Kalevala, the Finns started to get very proud again. It incurred a nationalistic feeling. Even so, though, they were being fought over Finland, Sweden, and Russia. So in the early 1900s, many Finns immigrated to New England and Minnesota, and wherever the blueberry bush grows, according to Hanala, a man who's written a book called The Blueberry God. And yes, we have blueberries growing right over there, so I think that's one of the reasons that Mr. Nokkalangi chose this area to build the camp. In Maynard, the Knights and Ladies of Kaleva were formed in around 1915, and as was mentioned, they are an international organization, and we have national get-togethers, Ohio or Thunder Bay, and when I was a child growing up in the 60s, the clubhouse was located on River Street near the telephone company. And one of the things that they would always have is the kids like the Greculas from Acton and me with my violin, and we'd play music. Now, a lot of us weren't raised to speak the Finnish language, but we knew when we went to the clubhouse or we had Finnish relatives or this language would be spoken. But we certainly picked up on a few of the customs, such as the great coffee. Sometimes when Finns drink their coffee, they put the cube of sugar in the side of their mouth, and you'll hear the Finns who've grown up in other parts of the country mention that. And then they have the wonderful pulla or nissu, and we have some on the back table. It's the braided Finnish coffee bread with sugar sprinkled on top. It's great toasted with butter. When my dad went to school, his first language was Finnish, and he learned how to speak English by being in school. And even the kids who weren't Finnish, like Jimmy Fraser, he was of Scottish background, he spoke Finnish in school, so it was a really common language in Maynard. And my dad had wooden skis, and he actually would take his cross-country skis to scoot off to school. He graduated in 1938, just to place him in your age brackets. The ancient flute teacher that some of you may remember, Mr. Toffery, he used to always perform at those Christmas performances down at the old clubhouse. And the reason we had the clubhouse in Maynard is, well, one of the reasons, we didn't have electricity or running water. Well, we had electricity, but we didn't have running water. It wasn't winterized. And this has just occurred in the last 6 or 7 years, so now we're able to stay here year-round. So, some of you may also be interested to know from Maynard that St. George's Church also had a little section on Foot Pond over here, too, in the early days. Okay, one thing we were hoping we were going to be able to show tonight, and hopefully we will in the future, will be the annual 6-mile race that occurred from Maynard to Fort Pond. My grandfather was quite the athlete, had many medals and trophies, and one of his strengths, other than the javelin, was the racing. So he was able to run with Johnny Kelly in this race that we have some film footage of. So we're looking forward to being able to see that soon. Ice fishing, of course, is one of the main pastimes of a lot of the Finnish Americans that I know. And I had mentioned earlier why the nomads had eventually settled on this granite peninsula that nobody else wanted, called Finland. Well, you'll notice if you walk around here on a nicer day that we do have a lot of granite around here too. So I think there's a little bit of Finland right here that help people remind themselves of the old country. The birch tree too is a really traditional tree that is found in many celebrations in Finnish households. And we used to have an outdoor fireplace out there. That's the older side. And a high diving board. And wooden rafts, which we still will do. Every once in a while we'll put out another wooden raft. But that was also just part of their Sunday pastimes. And in the middle of the Sunday afternoon, I can remember someone would walk up and down this path, and up and down this path, ringing that bell that's over on the organ there. And that was to let you know that the coffee was on. And there was a little old-fashioned Coca-Cola refrigerator here on the porch, and you would pick out cherry-flavored or strawberry-flavored soda and have your nissu, or coffee Finnish bread. I guess the holidays are also kind of neat. I mentioned the Kaleva Day, but we're coming upon Midsummer's Eve, or St. John's Day, or Johannes, which is the Finnish word for that. And that's supposed to be a very magical day. Lots of romance and love occurs, a lot of folklore occurring with that. And every year, Finnish Independence Day is celebrated in December. And we also have penny sales here and breakfasts. We have Saturday evening penny sales. Sometimes we'll have a Finnish dance group perform, and they wear the native costumes, which show which section of Finland you're from. Each area, like county, wears a different Finnish outfit. And we've had the Littleton Historical Society come here and talk, and they were kind of interested in some of the Native American legends. Supposedly what occurs in a lot of the old tales from the Native Americans is some big loud sound. They think maybe an earthquake had occurred out here. And we think that there's a fishing weir out in the center because it's pretty low with a lot of rocks that are able to be, you could put the nets for to catch the fish out there in the middle. So, I don't know, we still are researching that. And every Memorial Day, which is coming up tomorrow, for us, we remember our departed brothers and sisters, our fellow members. And if you haven't already been in the other room, we have a lovely display assembled by Ellen Hangis of all kinds of artifacts and photos that tell you more about our history. And Tervetuloa, welcome, thank you so much, Kitos, for coming here and showing, letting us show you our.
I'm sure we could ask some questions, and these ladies would be willing to answer. But before I do that, I've got a surprise for you. The surprise is this. Ellen mentioned that the Finnish War Veterans Chorus was here, what, 2 or 3 weeks ago?
23rd of April.
23rd of April, and this group had a reception for them. They had been in Boston all day on a duck tour, among other things. And they were really fed up with the rain and everything else, and they had a lovely time here. They had a lovely buffet for them. And these people took some pictures that night. My telephone rang Thursday, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and my cousin's son from Finland, who I have not spoken to for 40 years probably, said, "Is this Roy Helander?" And I said, "Yes." And then he identified himself, and he said, "I have my wife's sister and her husband who have just returned from America on a veterans tour, and they are here to show us some pictures." And the lady who had been here said to her sister, "This guy in the picture looks something like your husband's brother." And so my cousin's son took the thing and says, "Oh Lord," she says, "I think that's the cousin from America who keeps sending us pictures all the time, you know." And so it turned out to be me, because they found my name on the Sunday program then. And the lady got on the phone and talked to me and wanted me to be sure to tell you people that it was such a wonderful evening, and they really wanted all of you people who belong here to know that they really, really loved the time they had here. So there you are. I didn't hear anything about the summer camps when the kids from various other places used to come. Would you say something about that?
Excuse me. Before I like standing in one place. In the late 1930s, there was a group of members from New York City and from Fitchburg, with whom Maynard has often been quite close, and the Maynard group started a summer school. It was a 2-week course, and they had 2 or 3 teachers. They taught Finnish history, the Finnish language, biographies, and music, of course. A lot of lovely games. I don't know, perhaps there are still some of the children around who attended. Then along came the war, and they had to disband it for a while, and they continued after the war. But they really had a good turnout, and some of the pictures on the tables show what they call the summer school. They lived in tents, some of them, and others, well, maybe mostly women, or the young ladies, stayed in the cabins, but the boys preferred the tent life. And it was really a rich time for them, but gradually things changed, and it disbanded, unfortunately.
Any other questions while she's up here? Any other questions while you're there?
I have a question. So, what sort of trades and occupations do Finns have in Maynard that brought them there?
Oh, it was mostly the woolen mill.
Okay.
Well, Roy can tell you a lot about that, too. Their life's tempo was the old mill whistle, really. You'd hear it about 4:07 in the morning, they'd go to the mill. People, I think the greater portion of them were weavers, were they not? They had the dye house and so forth, but there were several thousand who worked in the mills. Do you remember how many? A couple thousand anyway, I think.
There were a lot of people there,
Yeah.
of all sorts of nationalities. But
Yeah, but the Finns, most of them were weavers. And of course, the whistle was their boss in the morning, 4:07, and they, at 7 o'clock, the last whistle blew, and then you could hear the loom stop. You could even hear him up onto where we lived once in a while.
And that's one reason why many of the weavers are deaf. Very, very deaf. Because
I wasn't a weaver, but I'm getting
there.
this.
There all the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But it was quite an industry, I guess. It was, at one time, it was known as the largest woolen mill in the world, single woolen mill in the world. This was in the early years. So, kind of interesting.
Any other questions?
When the Finnish people had that day camp, didn't they also have one at Rose's Pond?
Yeah,
We used to take a bus up and spend the day there?
that was the co-op that ran that.
Yeah.
But it was about, yeah.
Right.
In these spin towns, every organization loved this sort of thing. And so even in Maynard, the Temperance Society had a summer camp over in West Concord. What do we call that? Bunga. They called it Bunga Hari, but it was on, what's the name of the pond?
Water's Pond?
Is that,
On Harriman.
on Harriman? Well, anyway, they had a place there which was very similar, but they didn't have cabins like this. And then the socialists had Vosis. Vosis, the pond, which is now the housing development.
They were socialists.
Well, that's the interesting thing. Yeah, in the fall, we're going to have a program on co-ops and the people that founded it. I just want to set the world straight. You remember when Ken Olson came last fall and spoke at the high school, he started his lecture with the fact that Maynard was a communist town. And I just want to straighten that out in the fall as to where the communists were. He had them rather mixed up.
I remember going to that camp,
Yeah.
and I remember the food was wonderful. My counselor was Honey Honker.
Honey Honkin. Okay. Very good. I had one year the co-op rented this place, and we had the co-op camp up here for, well, maybe 1 or 2 years. It was always a 2-week thing where it was a day thing, you know, we bust the kids in for 6 hours or so and then bust them back again. And the year I was here, I had just got out of college, and I was supposedly running this camp of this bunch of kids. And Marion, the school teacher, Marion Legend, was my assistant, supposedly. And when thunderstorms hit this granite, it's something else, I'll tell you. We had all the kids in here, and the most horrible thunderstorm came up, and the earth was shaking. So I was sitting at the piano trying to get these kids to sing, and I kept saying, Marion, Marion, and Marion was down on her knees saying the rosary. But we lived through it, so I don't know if it was her work or mine. Any other questions? Yes.
I might make a comment that one of the first volunteers in World War II was Belly Kangas, a Finn from Maynard.
That's right. That's right. Alongside this fellow right here.
Hey, Roy?
Yes.
Which group went to Acton? Wasn't there a camp in Acton?
A camp in
Wasn't
Acton.
that Finnish group had something similar to this in Acton?
There's a Fort Pond in Lancaster, and that's our Fitchburg sister and brother organization. They meet, you know, in the wintertime in Fitchburg itself, and then they go out for the summertime in Lancaster. So, and it's so confusing because it's called Fort Pond, very close to our Fort Pond.
And they have something that's missing here. A sauna on the lake, a steam bath. And I'm sure they don't have it here because the law won't allow it, is that
Law
right?
won't allow it, and I think that Fitchburg's had to disband theirs because of the legal situation.
Is that right? Yeah.
It's too bad because it's very popular.
Yeah. Yeah. Any more questions? If not, we're going to show you a short film. While the Finns lived in their little Finn towns, they didn't lose touch with the old country. And in the 20s, when movies started to become popular, there were a group of entrepreneurs who arranged to bring the latest films from Finland and show them to the Finnish Americans. And they used to show them at first in the halls, and the sound and the picture would be rather poor. But then time went along, and they used to show them in the Colonial Theater in Maynard. So they'd advertise it, and they'd hire the theater for an afternoon or so, and they'd show these films. Well, then in the late 30s, they began to show some news films from Finland, pictures of what the country looked like. These people many of them had never been back after they came here at the turn of the century, and they started to show some sort of pictures that showed what the country looked like. And then when the war came, there was a film about Helsinki being bombed in 1939 by the Russians. And somehow this film got left here. And it was found amongst this supply that we had hoped to show you tonight, but will at some other time. And so this takes only 12 minutes. It's not very pleasant, I'll tell you that. But with what's going on in the Yugoslav area, you might just give a thought to what it's like to be in one of those cities when you're being bombed.
Susan, we don't need sound.
Pardon?
We don't need sound.
Okay. These films are a truly great achievement. The cameraman successfully worked equipment in 40 below zero weather while braving destruction from land and Water? Red Russia threatens proud and free Finland.
Leave it there. Don't say it.
President Kallio weighs Russia's ultimatum. Russia strikes. Red bombs fire Helsinki. Finns march to meet the foe. Startled civilians seek shelter from reign of terror. Reign.
Later, Arctic snows come to their brave defense.
It was one of the coldest winters Finland ever had, 1959.
Beautiful country.
This is how I pictured my dad going to Maynard High School in the wintertime. Burning their own homes to hamper Red advance. Heroic Finns utilized their friendly force. Camouflaged in white, famous Finn skiers go into action. The History Museum in Colorado has mannequins dressed in this famous white outfit. They were just completely invisible, the Finns on their skis, because they were dressed in white. Red divisions are trapped on narrow roads. Red soldiers ill-clothed for 40 below zero. Tons of supplies, thousands of prisoners captured by Finnish defenders. Russia lands troops from the skies. again raised by ruthless Russian bombs. But Finnish heroes still hold Mannerheim line.
That was a line, a defense line that had been dug in along between the two countries already earlier, very much like the Maginot line in France, if you remember.
Burned and bombed, Finland fights on. Well, that was obviously made for the American market in English to influence the Americans to come to their help. And I must say that where the Finnish organizations had existed for all these years, they weren't very friendly to each other. Each one believed in its own way of doing things, and they weren't very happy about, as growing up on a Finnish street in Maynard, we lived on Fairfield, and Fairfield from top of the hill down to the bottom, and some of the next street over was all Finns. And there were Finns from everywhere. There were Lutherans, there were Congregationalists, there were Socialists, there were even a couple of Communists, there were people from Kaleva, and everybody got along beautifully as neighbors, but the feeling of what the organizations were doing was not always so pleasant, until this came about. And when Finland needed aid, they all got together to assist. And so it was really a very important point in our lives. The communists weren't involved. They did not get involved with this togetherness. And it wasn't until the FinFest started about 15 years ago. FinFest is a big national holiday sort of thing where all the Finns gather for a weekend or so and start to learn about their backgrounds, that we've gotten to know each other. We didn't really know too much about what was going on at the other place that you never visited, the other hall, the other church. It wasn't until this FinFest started and you started to go to lectures and hear what each one was doing that things have really calmed down very much. Any other questions?